He became one of the richest men in Rome while writing that wealth could never make a person free. He taught an emperor from boyhood, and the world remembers that emperor as a monster. He spent his life writing about how a person should meet death. When the order finally came, in the year 65, the death he had rehearsed on paper turned out to be slow, painful, and almost impossible to complete. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. 2,000 years later, his letters sit on nightstands in New York and London and Berlin, read by people who have never opened another work of ancient philosophy. They read him because he does not sound ancient. He sounds like a tired man at the end of a long day, telling a friend the truth. But the man behind those letters lived a life his philosophy could not resolve. Exile, power, compromise, and a death sentence signed by the boy he raised. Tonight, we follow that life from a small city in Roman Spain to the centre of the world. So settle in and let the story carry you. It begins with a child who could barely breathe. Cordoba sat in the far south of Spain, on the banks of a wide, slow river the Romans called the Baetis. Today the city is Cordoba and the river is the Guadalquivir. But in the final years before the Common Era, this was one of the proudest Roman towns outside of Italy itself. Olive groves covered the hills in silver-green rows. Ships moved down the river toward the sea, loaded with oil and wine and wool. The streets had forums and temples and schools, and the families who ran the city spoke Latin, dressed like Romans, and raised their sons to believe that the road from this provincial river town could lead, if a boy was unshrented enough and stubborn enough, all the way to Rome, into one of those families. Sometime around the year 4, before the Common Era, a second son was born. The exact year is not certain. Ancient records from the provinces were not kept the way modern records are, and historians still debate the date within a range of a few years. What we know is the name he was given: Lucius Annaeus Seneca. The household he arrived in was already an ambitious one. His father, known to history as Seneca the Elder, was a wealthy man of the equestrian class, the rank of Roman society just below the senators. The father had a passion that shaped everything about the family. He loved the art of speaking. He had spent years in Rome studying the great orators, listening to the most famous voices of the age argue imaginary court cases for sport, and he possessed, by his own account in the writings he left behind, a memory so unusual that he claimed he could hear 2,000 names read aloud and repeat them back in order. Allow for a proud man polishing his own legend, and it was still clear that this was a formidable mind. He wrote books on rhetoric that survive in part to this day, and he expected his 3 sons to master words the way other fathers expected their sons to master horses or accounts. The mother of the family was named Helvia, and she deserves more than the single line most ancient women receive. Years later, when Seneca was at the lowest point of his life, he would write her a long letter that still survives, and through it we catch a glimpse of an intelligent, serious woman who had wanted to study philosophy herself. Her husband, a traditionalist of the old Roman type, did not consider deep learning proper for a wife, and she was allowed, in Seneca's words, only to taste the studies she might have mastered. Her son noticed that it is hard to read his later insistence that philosophy belongs to everyone. women included, and not here an echo of the mother in the house in Corduba. There were 3 boys. The eldest, Novatus, steady and capable, would grow up to govern a Roman province, and under an adopted name, Gallio, he would one day appear briefly in the pages of the New Testament as the official who declined to judge a case involving a man named Paul of Tarsus. The youngest, Mela, quieter and more private, would become the father of a poet named Lucan, whose fate would one day be tangled with his uncle's in the darkest possible way. And in the middle was Lucius, the one with the promise, and the one with the problem. The problem was his body. From childhood, Seneca was sick. He suffered from a condition the Romans called suspirium, which means, roughly, the sighing disease, and which modern readers of his letters generally recognize as severe asthma, possibly combined with some other chronic trouble of the lungs. In one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, written near the end of his life, he described the attacks himself. He said the doctors called the condition a rehearsal for death, because that is what it felt like. The breath simply stops arriving. The chest fights for air that will not come. An attack was short, he wrote, like a storm, usually over within an hour. But inside that hour, a person does not think about plans or money or reputation. A person thinks about the next breath, and whether there will be one. Most of us meet the idea of death slowly, from a safe distance, through the losses of others. This boy met it personally, in his own chest, over and over, before he was old enough to understand what it was. Later in life, he wrote that there had been a period in his youth when the illness grew so relentless, and wore him so thin, that he seriously considered ending his own life, and that the only thing that held him back was the thought of his father, who could not have borne the loss. That is not a detail from a philosophy textbook. That is a young man standing at an edge, and choosing to stay, for love of someone else. Biographers have long pointed out that you cannot understand anything Seneca wrote without starting here. The philosophy he would one day become famous for, the calm voice telling readers to rehearse loss in advance, to hold life lightly, to treat each day as something borrowed rather than owned. None of it began as theory. It began as survival. Other philosophers argued about mortality in lecture halls. Seneca negotiated with it at night, alone, fighting for air. The family did what wealthy Roman families did. They looked toward Rome. The father's ambitions and the son's talent both pointed there. And at some point in Seneca's early childhood, he made the long journey from Spain to the capital. According to his own later account, he was carried to Rome in the arms of his aunt, his mother's sister, a woman whose steadiness he would praise for the rest of his life. The detail is small, but it stays with you. The future advisor to emperors did not march into Rome. He arrived as a sick little boy, held in the arms of a woman who was looking after him. Rome, when he was old enough to walk its streets and understand it, was unlike anything the ancient world had ever produced. Perhaps 1 million people lived there, packed into towering apartment blocks, spilling through markets and bathhouses and temples, ruled now by an aging emperor named Augustus, who had ended a century of civil war and gathered the power of the old republic into his own hands. The city was loud, dangerous, magnificent, and absolutely certain that it was the centre of the world. For a boy from a river town in Spain, it must have been overwhelming. It must also have been, in a way his father entirely approved of, a challenge, because one thing about Seneca emerged early and never left. The body was weak. The will was not. The boy who could not always breathe threw himself into the training his father arranged. The grammar, the literature, the endless exercises in speaking, and he turned out to be better at it than almost anyone. Words obeyed him. Arguments arranged themselves under his hands. Teachers began to notice, and in Rome, being noticed was the beginning of everything. But somewhere in those student years, the boy wandered into a room his father had not planned for him, a philosophy lecture, and what he found there did not just interest him, it seized him, and it never let go. Imagine a plain room near the centre of Rome. Early in the morning, benches, a small crowd of young men, and at the front a Stoic teacher named Attalus, talking about fortune. Most of the students drift in late and leave early. One student does neither. He is thin, pâle, a Spaniard's son with shadows under his eyes from nights spent fighting his own lungs, and he arrives before everyone and stays after everyone. Decades later, in his letters, Seneca remembered exactly what that felt like. He said he used to lay siege to that classroom. He was the first to come and the last to go. And when Attalus described the mind that fortune cannot touch, Seneca wrote that the teacher seemed to him something more than human. To understand why the words landed so hard, you have to understand what philosophy actually was in Rome, because it was not what the word suggests today. It was not an academic subject, studied for examinations and set aside. For the people who took it seriously, it was training for life, almost medical in its intentions. The question it asked was brutally practical. How do you live well in a world you do not control? How do you keep your footing when fortune takes away your money, your health, your family, your freedom? In a city where a ruler's mood could end a career or a life in an afternoon, these were not abstract questions. And the Stoic answer, the answer Attalus taught, was stark and strangely comforting at once. The only thing that truly belongs to you is your own judgment, your own character, your own response. Everything else, wealth, status, reputation, even the body itself, is on loan from fortune, and fortune keeps her own schedule for taking things back. A person who understands this can lose everything external and still remain standing, because the essential thing was never external to begin with. Other students heard theory. Seneca heard a description of his own life. His body had been teaching him the same lesson since childhood, that what you count on can be withdrawn without notice, and that something in you has to learn to stand anyway. The philosophy did not give him a new idea so much as it gave words to an old wound. He took it further than his father would have liked. Under the influence of another teacher, a man named Sotion, who was connected to the older school of the philosopher Pythagoras, the young Seneca gave up eating meat. He kept the practice for about a year, and by his own account he was thriving on it, until his father intervened. This was not, for the old man, about diet. At that moment in Rome, foreign religious practices were under official suspicion, and refusing meat could look like membership in one of the suspect groups. The father, who according to Seneca had little patience for philosophy anyway, asked his son to return to ordinary eating, and the son complied. It is a small story, but it is the whole family in miniature. The son on fire with ideas, the father practical and wary, pulling him back toward the safe and the respectable, a third teacher, Papirius Fabianus, closed the circle. Fabianus had been a star of the rhetoric schools, who walked away from that career to teach philosophy instead, and in him the two halves of Seneca's education finally met. Words and wisdom did not have to be rivals. A sentence could be beautiful and true at the same time. If any single person showed Seneca the writer he would eventually become, it was probably this quiet defector from his father's world. So the path seemed clear. The gifted student would finish his training, enter public life, and begin the climb through the offices of the Roman state. Then the body intervened again. In his 20s, the illness came back with a force that threatened to end everything. The breathing trouble deepened into something longer and more wasting, an exhaustion that would not lift. Some modern readers of his letters have suggested tuberculosis may have joined the asthma, though at this distance no one can say. What is certain is that Rome, crowded and smoky and damp, was no place to recover. The family reached for a solution, and the solution had a familiar face. The aunt who had carried him to Rome as a child was now living in Egypt, where her husband served as prefect, the Roman governor of the province. Seneca was sent to her, to the dry air of Alexandria, to rest and to heal. He stayed for years. Alexandria was the second city of the empire, a place of libraries and scholars, and trade from 3 continents. And though Seneca left no full account of his time there, later writers noticed that his works carry a lasting curiosity about Egypt, its river, its geography, its customs. He read, he observed, he recovered, slowly, in the way chronic illness allows, which is never completely. Around the year 31 of the Common Era, when Seneca was in his mid-30s, the aunt's husband finished his term, and the family sailed for Rome. The voyage ended in disaster. The ship went down, and the uncle drowned. His wife survived the wreck, and Seneca later wrote with admiration of how she brought her husband's body home for burial. A woman who had lost everything at sea and still saw the last duty through. This was the second time she had carried her family through danger, and she was not finished. Once they reached Rome, it was reportedly her influence, quietly applied in the right places, that helped secure her nephew his first public office, the quaestorship, the entry gate to the Roman Senate. So the picture has changed. The sick boy from Spain is a senator of Rome, somewhere around 40 years old, late for a Roman career, but moving at last. His speeches are drawing crowds. His writing is beginning to circulate. Everything his father hoped for is finally happening. It was dangerous timing, because the Rome he was rising in was about to change hands, and the young man taking the throne would come to regard talent itself as a form of treason. His name was Gaius, but the world remembers him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, a name the soldiers gave him when he was a small boy in a tiny uniform in his father's army camps. He became emperor in the year 37, at the age of 24, and Rome greeted him with genuine joy. He was the son of a beloved general. He was young and energetic, a fresh start after the grim final years of the old Emperor Tiberius, who had spent his last decade ruling by suspicion. Letter, an execution from an island villa. The joy lasted less than a year. What happened to Caligula is still debated, and it is worth being careful here, because almost everything written about him was written by his enemies. Ancient authors describe a serious illness a few months into the reign, and a change afterward. Whether the illness caused the change, or simply revealed what was already there, or whether the surviving accounts painted him darker than the truth, no one can now untangle. But those accounts, hostile as they are, consistently describe the same experience of those years. Executions on thin pretexts, senators forced to grovel, wealth seized, a court where brilliance, beauty, or popularity could become a liability, because the emperor could not stand to be outshone. There is a particular flavour to that kind of court, and Rome learned it quickly. Under a ruler like this, applause was not a reward, it was a measurement, and the wrong measurement could kill you. Men who had spent their lives building reputations began quietly dismantling them. Speak too well, and you were competing. Dress too well, and you were displaying. Be admired by the wrong crowd on the wrong afternoon, and someone would mention your name at dinner in the palace, and the mention was the danger. And Seneca, in precisely these years, was becoming one of the most admired speakers in the Senate. The collision, when it came, was recorded by the historian Cassius Dio. Writing about a century and a half later, Seneca delivered a speech in the Senate with the emperor present, and delivered it too well. The chamber admired it. Caligula did not. According to Dio's account, the emperor ordered Seneca killed, and the order was real enough that what saved him sounds almost like dark comedy. One of the women of the court told Caligula that the execution was a waste of effort. The man was in the final stage of consumption. She reportedly said, "Look at him. He would be dead within months on his own. Caligula, let it go. Why execute a dying man?" The strangeness of that rescue deserves a breath. The illness that had stolen Seneca's childhood, that had nearly driven him to end his own life, that had exiled him to Egypt for years, that same illness now stepped in front of him like a shield. He lived because he looked like a man who would not. Seneca himself never told this story in his surviving works, which is worth saying plainly, and historians treat some of Dio's details with caution, but the outline fits everything else we know about the reign, and about the lesson Rome was learning in those years. Talent was not protection. Talent was exposure. Every gift you had was a light shining on you in a room where the most dangerous thing was to be seen. Caligula also left a famous verdict on Seneca's writing style, preserved by the biographer Suetonius. He called it sand without lime, sand without the binding that makes concrete hold, loose, glittering, unstructured. It was meant as an insult, and coming from a man who wanted its author dead, it carried weight beyond literary criticism. But it also tells you something about the writing itself. Those short, punching sentences, so different from the long, rolling architecture of Cicero a century before, were already distinctive enough to irritate the most powerful man in the world. Seneca had found his voice early, and his voice made enemies before his politics ever did. In January of the year 41, the reign ended the way such reigns tend to end. Officers of Caligula's own guard cornered him in a palace corridor and cut him down. He was 28 years old. Rome exhaled. The new emperor was his uncle, Claudius, a limping, stammering scholar whom the imperial family had hidden away for decades as an embarrassment, and whom the guard now hauled onto the throne, partly because he was the last adult male of the dynasty left standing. Rome hoped, again, for a fresh start, and Seneca had survived the emperor who wanted him dead. The cruel joke history was preparing is that the danger did not come from where he had learned to look for it. It was the mild, scholarly, harmless-looking Claudius whose reign was about to break Seneca's life in half, not with an execution, with an island. Claudius had been emperor for less than a year when Seneca's world ended. The charge was adultery. The woman named in the accusation was Julia Livilla, a sister of the dead Caligula, young, celebrated, and a granddaughter of the great Augustus himself. The person driving the accusation, according to the ancient sources, was the new empress, Messalina, Claudius's wife, who saw the emperor's glamorous nieces as rivals for influence and wanted them removed. Julia Livilla was exiled and later put to death, and Seneca, the famous senator caught in the story built around her, was sentenced to die as well. Was any of it true? At this distance, no one can say with certainty. Seneca never addressed the charge directly in his surviving works. The historian Tacitus, no flatterer of Seneca, later referred to the case in a way that suggests the verdict came from Messalina's scheming rather than from evidence. Most modern biographers read it as a political killing dressed in a moral costume, but the honest answer is that the truth of that accusation died with the people involved. What did not die is what happened next. Claudius reduced the sentence, not to freedom, to exile, and the place chosen was Corsica. Forget the Corsica of today, the vacation island. To a Roman of the 1st century, Corsica was the edge of the civilized world, a mountainous rock in the sea, known mainly for bitter honey and hard living. In the letter of consolation, he wrote to his mother from the island. Seneca described his new home in lines soaked with deprivation, a barren place, thinly settled, rough in climate and rough in everything else. Allow for the rhetoric of a man making a point about how little he needed, and the point still stands on real ground. Here was a man who had spent his whole life climbing, from Corduba to Rome, from the classroom to the Senate floor, from sickness to fame, and somewhere around 45 years old the climb was over. Everything was gone. The audiences, the libraries, the career, the city itself, which for a Roman senator was not just a home, but the entire meaning of life. And now this story arrives at the years that made the Philosopher. Because it is easy to write about losing everything when you have lost nothing. Corsica was a laboratory with one subject, himself. And the question on the table was the exact question his teachers had drilled into him decades earlier. When fortune takes it all away, does the philosophy hold? The record of those years survives in 2 remarkable documents, and they do not tell the same story about the man who wrote them. The first is the letter he sent to his mother, Helvia, back in Rome. It is often called the consolation to Helvia. and it may be the most unusual condolence letter ever written, because the loss she was grieving was him. The exile writes to comfort the people who still have their freedom. In it, Seneca tells his mother, in essence, "Do not weep for me, because nothing that matters has been taken. His mind is intact. His studies travel with him. The stars over Corsica are the same stars that hang over Rome. Exile," he argues, "is only a change of place, and every place is equally a home to a person whose real citizenship is the universe itself. It is Stoicism at full strength." And generations of readers in hard places, prisoners, refugees, people stripped of their old lives, have testified that these pages helped them stand up. The second document is harder to read. In every sense, a few years into the exile, Seneca addressed a work to a man named Polybius, a powerful former slave who served as one of Claudius's closest secretaries. On its surface, it consoles Polybius for the death of his brother. Woven through it, unmistakably, is something else. Praise for Claudius, elaborate, glowing praise for the emperor who had sent Seneca to the rock, along with what reads plainly as a plea to be brought home. Later generations have winced at it. Some scholars have argued it drips with hidden sarcasm. Others have suggested the text was tampered with. But the simplest reading is also the hardest one. It is the sound of a brilliant man begging, and hating it, and doing it anyway. Hold both documents in your mind at once, because together they are a portrait that neither one provides alone. The same island, the same years, the same hand. One page says, "I need nothing. My soul is beyond your reach." The other page says, "Please, let me come home." Was he a hypocrite? That is the easy word, and people have thrown it at Seneca for 2,000 years. But ask yourself honestly, as a listener lying in the dark, if you were taken from everyone you love and left on a rock in the sea, which of those two letters would you write? The true answer, for most of us, is both. Courage and weakness do not take turns in a human life. They share the same night, sometimes the same hour. What makes Seneca worth following is not that he resolved that contradiction. It is that he left both pages on the table where we could see them. The years passed, 1, then 3, then 5, then 8. A man ages differently in a place where nothing is coming. He studied the island, the sea, the sky. He wrote. He waited without knowing what he was waiting for. He had no way of knowing that his rescue was already moving toward him, wearing silk, trailed by rumours, carrying a plan in which he was one small piece on a very large board. Back in Rome, the Empress Messalina, the woman whose intrigues had put him on the island, had finally overreached. In the year 48, in a scandal almost too strange for fiction, she staged something like a wedding with another man while Claudius was out of the city, and whether it was passion or the first move of a coup, it finished her. The emperor's men killed her before he could change his mind about it. Claudius needed a new wife. The court needed a new centre of power, and the woman who stepped forward to claim both positions was one of the most formidable operators Rome ever produced. Her name was Agrippina. She was Caligula's sister, and Julia Livilla's sister, and the emperor's own niece, and she had a young son from an earlier marriage. Everything she did from this point forward every alliance, every appointment, every kindness, and every crime served a single project, that boy on the throne, and for reasons that would change the course of Seneca's life. Her project needed a philosopher. In the year 49, an imperial order crossed the sea to Corsica. The exile was recalled. After 8 years, Seneca was going home. The historian Tacitus, our best source for these events, lays out the mechanics plainly. Agrippina, newly married to Claudius, asked for Seneca's recall as one of her first public moves, and she did not do it out of charity. Tacitus lists her reasons with his usual cold clarity. Seneca was famous, and his return from an exile widely seen as unjust would be popular. His literary brilliance was known across the empire, and she wanted him for a specific job, tutor to her son, a boy of about 11, whose name at birth had been Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and whom history would come to know by the name he took when Claudius adopted him the following year, Nero. Think about what that boat ride home must have contained, because it is one of the great hinge points of this entire story. Seneca was somewhere around 50. He had spent 8 years learning. At the deepest level, a person can learn anything. That power is poison. That fortune's gifts come with hooks in them. That the wise man needs nothing but his own soul. That was the philosophy, tested on the rock, written in his own hand, and the boat carrying him home was taking him directly into the household of the imperial family, into the orbit of Agrippina, into the very centre of everything his philosophy warned against. Could he have refused? In theory, a Stoic might say yes. In practice, you did not refuse Agrippina, and you certainly did not refuse a recall by staying voluntarily on the island. And beneath the practical answer sits a more uncomfortable one that his critics have pointed at ever since. He did not want to refuse. The letters from exile had already shown it. He wanted to come back. He was a man of the city, of audiences and conversation and consequence. And the door was open, and he walked through it. Anyone listening tonight who has ever accepted a job they had doubts about, because the alternative was staying invisible, understands what was on that boat. Rome repaid his return quickly. He was given the praetorship, a senior office, and his real work began behind the palace walls. Teaching the boy, what do we actually know about those classroom years? Less than we would like. The biographer Suetonius reports one detail that has fascinated historians ever since. Agrippina kept her son away from the study of philosophy. It was not, in her view, a fit subject for a future ruler. So the most famous philosopher in Rome was hired to teach everything except the thing he was famous for: rhetoric, speech, literature, the arts of presentation and persuasion. She wanted her son polished, not deep. Suetonius also passes along a rumour that circulated later, that Seneca dreamed one night he was tutoring Caligula, and understood the dream soon enough. The story is almost certainly a legend built after everyone knew how things ended, but the fact that Romans told it shows what they came to believe, that something in the boy was there from the start, and the teacher had seen it. The truth of the boy is harder to reach, buried under everything he became. Ancient accounts describe the young Nero as artistic, eager to sing and perform, hungry for approval, and thoroughly under the control of a mother whose ambition filled every room she entered. Seneca taught him to speak. By several accounts he wrote, or helped write, the speeches the young prince delivered in public, graceful performances that impressed the crowds. Whatever else can be said about the arrangement, the education worked. When the moment came, the boy would step onto the world stage sounding wise beyond his years, because the words in his mouth belonged to a wise man standing just out of sight. Meanwhile, around teacher and student, Agrippina completed her project with terrifying efficiency. Claudius adopted Nero, placing him ahead of the emperor's own younger son, Britannicus, in the line of succession. Nero was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, binding him into the family twice over. Honours arrived years early. The pieces moved, onto their squares. And then, in October of the year 54, Claudius died. The ancient historians, Tacitus among them, report the story that swept Rome and has never left the history books, that the emperor was poisoned at dinner by a dish of mushrooms prepared on Agrippina's instructions. Some modern scholars note that a man of Claudius's age and health could have died naturally, and the truth is beyond recovery now. What no one disputes is the choreography that followed. The palace gates were held, the announcement was timed, and when the doors finally opened, it was Nero, 16 years old, who walked out to the guards and was hailed as Emperor of Rome. Two figures had done more than anyone else to place that boy where he now stood, and to prepare him for it, his mother and his teacher. One of them believed she was about to rule the world through her son. The other was about to discover what it costs to try to put a conscience inside a king. For the next several years, these two would fight, mostly in silence, over the character of a teenager who held the entire world in his hands. And the strangest part, the part almost no one saw coming, is that for a while it seemed to work. The first thing the new emperor did was speak, and the words were Seneca's. Tacitus records the sequence of those opening days. Nero, 16 years old, addressed the Praetorian Guard, then the Senate, in speeches that struck exactly the right notes. He promised to rule the way the revered Augustus had ruled. He promised to respect the Senate's authority, to keep the emperor's private household separate from the business of the state, to end the secret treason trials that had poisoned the previous reigns. Picture that morning in the Senate house. The winter light coming through the high windows. Rows of men in white wool who had survived Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius, listening to a boy promise them a different Rome. The ancient sources are explicit about the authorship. The voice was Nero's. The mind behind the voice belonged to his teacher, and people remarked on it at the time, because earlier emperors had always found their own words, and this one arrived with words prepared for him. A detail from those early months was preserved because it seemed to promise so much. Brought a death warrant to sign. The young emperor reportedly sighed and said, "How I wish I had never learned to write." Whether the line was spontaneous or coached, Rome loved it. A ruler who hated signing executions. After Caligula, after the fear-soaked years of Claudius, it sounded like mourning. What followed is a period that later Romans look back on with something close to disbelief. A tradition reported from a later century even claimed that the Emperor Trajan, no admirer of tyrant, said that no period of imperial government compared to the first 5 years of Nero. Historians call this stretch the quinquennium, the 5 good years, roughly the years 54 to 59. Later, tradition idealized them, and modern historians disagree about exactly how good they were, when they began and ended, and how much of the credit belongs to any one person. But the broad picture is consistent. Taxes were moderated, the courts functioned, the borders were managed by competent generals. For several years, the Roman world was governed with a degree of restraint that later generations remembered with something like nostalgia. That restraint had 2 sources, and neither of them was the emperor. One was Seneca, the other was a soldier named Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, a blunt veteran with a crippled hand whom Agrippina had installed in his post, and who turned out to be far more principled than she had planned. Tacitus describes the partnership between the philosopher and the soldier as something rare in the history of power. 2 men in a position to compete who chose instead to cooperate. Seneca supplied the words, the policy, the political intelligence. Burrus supplied the discipline and the loyalty of the troops. Between them, they became the 2 strongest restraining influences around the young man who wore the purple. It was in these years that Seneca also put his political philosophy on paper in a work addressed directly to Nero, called De Clementia, on mercy. It survives, and, if the usual dating is correct, it was written and circulating in the middle of the 50s. In the first years of the reign, it is an astonishing document to read with hindsight. Seneca holds up a mirror to the young emperor and describes what he hopes the reflection will become. Absolute power, the book argues, is safest when it restrains itself. The ruler who is feared must fear everyone in return, while the merciful ruler sleeps soundly, guarded not by soldiers, but by the good will of the governed. Mercy, Seneca insists, is not weakness. It is the one virtue that separates a king from a tyrant, and the tyrant, however secure he looks, is already dying from the inside. Philosophers had lectured rulers before. This was something more specific. A manual for holding unlimited power without being destroyed by it, addressed by name to a teenager who possessed exactly that power. It is the clearest window we have into what Seneca believed he was doing in the palace. He was not there to flatter. He was there to build a conscience, in public, in prose, and hope the boy would grow into it. The first great war of the reign was not against any foreign enemy. It was against the emperor's mother. Agrippina had expected to rule through her son. The opening weeks seemed to confirm it. Her face appeared beside Nero's on the coinage, an honour almost without precedent for a woman. Then, gradually, the coins changed. Her image shrank, then vanished. The ancient sources describe Seneca and Burrus working, carefully and constantly, to loosen the mother's grip on the young emperor, redirecting her interventions, blocking her from official business. Tacitus tells of a moment when envoys from a foreign power were being received, and Agrippina moved to mount the imperial platform and sit beside her son, as if she were his fellow ruler. It was Seneca, alert to the catastrophe such an image would create, who prompted Nero to step down and greet his mother, turning a constitutional crisis into a gesture of filial courtesy. The choreography saved appearances. The war underneath continued. Ask the fair question. Was any of this what a philosopher should be doing? Managing a prince's image, easing a dangerous mother away from power, writing beautiful speeches for a ruler whose own character remained unformed. Seneca's defenders, ancient and modern, answer with the results. For those years, the empire was steadier and gentler than it had been in a generation, because a philosopher stood next to the throne. His critics answer with what was already visible up close. The emperor was not becoming wise, he was becoming managed, and a managed man, sooner or later, notices. The strain showed early in small, human ways. Nero fell in love with a former slave named Acte, and Seneca quietly helped provide cover for the affair, judging, according to Tacitus, that a harmless romance was safer than the alternatives for a young man locked in a loveless political marriage. Agrippina exploded, then tried flattery, then threats. In the middle of one of these family storms, she made a mistake that no one in the palace ever forgot. She reminded her son that Britannicus, the dead Claudius's own boy, was approaching manhood, and that a truer heir of the dynasty was available if her ungrateful son proved disappointing. Within months, in the year 55, Britannicus was dead. Picture the room as the sources describe it: a palace dining hall, the younger members of the imperial family seated at their own table as custom required, lamps lit, the noise of a normal evening. The boy drinks, and within moments he cannot speak, and he is carried out. The official explanation was an epileptic seizure. Tacitus and the other ancient historians report what Rome actually believed, that the boy was poisoned on Nero's orders, the drink tested and cooled precisely so the taster could pass it safely before the poison went in, and that Nero remarked calmly from his couch that the boy had always suffered such fits. The lamps stayed lit. The dinner went on. History does not place Seneca at that table, and it does not preserve a single word of what he said or thought. When the news reached him, what it does preserve is the decision that followed, and the decision is the point. He stayed. His surviving works record no break with Nero, no protest, no resignation. The author of On Mercy, the book that told a young king that a ruler's hands must stay clean, remained in the service of a ruler whose hands, if Rome's belief was correct, were clean no longer, and if the usual dating of that book holds, its sentences about mercy were being copied and admired in a palace that already knew what had happened at that dinner. Why did he stay? Perhaps he told himself that leaving would change nothing except who advised the next decision. Perhaps he believed the good he could still do outweighed the evil he could not prevent. Perhaps, as his harshest critics have said for 2,000 years, the palace had simply become comfortable. We cannot see inside him. We can only see what he did, which was to keep working, keep steering, keep holding the structure together, while the young man at the centre of it grew steadily less willing to be held. And there is one more thing everyone in Rome could see. During these same years, the philosopher was becoming rich beyond ordinary imagination. That wealth is a story of its own, and it has followed his name for 2,000 years. Let us talk honestly about the money, because everyone in Rome talked about it, and because no honest telling of this life can walk past it. Service at the top of the empire paid, gifts from the emperor, estates, investments, the ordinary harvest of proximity to power, and Seneca refused none of it. The ancient sources put his fortune at 300 million sesterces. Translating ancient money is notoriously slippery. But for scale, a Roman legionary soldier earned about 900 sesterces a year. Whatever the modern equivalent, the meaning was plain to everyone. The man who wrote that wealth could never make a person free had become one of the wealthiest private individuals in the Roman world. He owned estates in Italy and Egypt. Cassius Dio mentions 500 identical tables of citrus wood with ivory legs, a detail that may be hostile exaggeration, but that stuck to his reputation like tar. And Dio reports something more serious than furniture. He writes that Seneca lent enormous sums to the leading men of Britannia, then abruptly called in the loans, and that the squeeze was among the grievances behind the great British uprising led by the Queen, remembered as Boudica, a revolt that burned Roman towns and killed tens of thousands. Modern historians debate how much weight to give that claim, since Dio wrote generations later and disliked Seneca, but even as a rumour, it shows the shape of the accusation. Not just a rich philosopher, a philosopher whose money moved through the machinery of empire, with consequences. His contemporaries did not let it pass. Tacitus preserves the attack of a senator named Suetonius, an old enemy, who asked in public the question everyone whispered: by what wisdom, by what teachings of philosophy, had Seneca piled up 300 million sesterces in 4 years of imperial friendship? Suetonius had his own corrupt record, and the attack was self-serving. And it also landed, because it was built on facts no one denied. Seneca answered, not in a courtroom, but in the way he always answered. In writing, he composed a work called On the Happy Life, and in it he faced the charge directly, with a frankness that still startles. You call me a hypocrite, he says, in essence, because I speak of virtue while living in wealth. But I never claimed to be a wise man. I claimed to be climbing toward wisdom, from far below, and if I demand of myself that I reach the summit before I am allowed to describe it, then no one may ever describe it. The philosopher, he argued, does not love riches, but he does not refuse them either. He holds them loosely. Wealth in a wise man's house is a servant. In a fool's house it is a master. And he added a line that generations have chewed on. The difference between me and you, he tells his accuser, is that my wealth belongs to me, while you belong to your wealth. Is that an answer? Or is it an alibi written by the most gifted prose stylist of his age? This story owes you both sides, told straight. The case against him is easy to state. Principles that always bend in the direction of comfort begin to look less like principles than like decoration. Seneca praised simplicity from a couch of citrus wood and ivory. He wrote that the wise man is indifferent to fortune, while accepting fortune's gifts from a man widely believed to have poisoned his own adoptive brother. The money was not incidental to the power. It was the power, and he kept both. The case for him is quieter, and it lives in the letters he wrote at the end of his life. There he describes his actual practices, setting aside days to eat the cheapest food and sleep rough, not as theatre but as training, so that if fortune ever took everything, The loss would find him already familiar with less. Rehearse poverty, he advised, so that poverty, if it comes, arrives as an acquaintance rather than a stranger, and when the end of his story comes, in a later chapter of this tale, you will see him offer his entire fortune back to Nero, unprompted, and be refused. Judge the man across the whole arc, his defenders say, and the money looks less like a betrayal of the philosophy than like its hardest test. One he faced late, and only partly, and at a price. Both of those cases are real. 2,000 years of readers have split over them, and tonight you do not have to choose. You only have to notice what the argument itself proves. We are still holding this one man to the standard of his own sentences, because the sentences were that good. Nobody asks whether the other rich men of Nero's Rome lived up to their writings. They left no writings. Seneca left a mirror, and every generation since has looked into it and seen its own compromises looking back. While Rome argued about his fortune, the structure that fortune rested on was beginning to crack. The emperor was in his early 20s now. He had discovered chariot racing, and singing, and late nights in the city, and flattering new friends who told him what his teacher never told him, that an emperor may do exactly as he pleases. He was shedding restraints one by one, the way a man sheds layers on a warming day. His mother had been moved out of the palace. His wife was ignored. Between Nero and the full exercise of his own appetites there remained, really, only a soldier's discipline and an old philosopher's disapproval. And in the spring of the year 59, on the Bay of Naples, the young emperor decided to test what those two forces would do about the thing he wanted most. In the spring of the year 59, the emperor of Rome decided to kill his mother. The ancient historians give different accounts of the final trigger. Tacitus points to a woman named Poppaea Sabina, ambitious, celebrated for her beauty, and married to one of Nero's friends, who wanted to be empress and understood that it would never happen while Agrippina lived. Others suggest the decision had been building for years. Through every quarrel, every reminder of who had made whom, whatever lit the fuse, the plan itself has come down to us in detail so strange that historians have debated it ever since, because it sounds like theatre. In a sense, it was. Nero had learned stagecraft, and he applied it. A straightforward execution was impossible. Agrippina was the daughter of a beloved general, the sister of one emperor, the widow of another, the mother of a third. So, according to Tacitus, a device was built, a ship, engineered to come apart at sea. The setting was the Bay of Naples, during a festival, wrapped inside a public reconciliation. Nero invited his mother to dinner, treated her with elaborate warmth, walked her down to the water, and according to the accounts, held her long in his arms as she boarded the vessel that was designed to drown her. The sea did not cooperate. The mechanism failed to kill her. The collapsing structure crushed one of her attendants, and in the darkness and confusion that followed, another attendant cried out that she was Agrippina, hoping to be pulled from the water first. The crew, who knew their real orders, beat that woman to death. Agrippina herself, wounded in the shoulder, understood everything in that instant. She slipped into the water and swam quietly away, and was picked up by a small boat and carried to her villa. She had survived a shipwreck built to murder her, and she now made the coldest calculation of her life. She sent a messenger to her son with the news that she was safe, mentioning nothing of what she knew. At the palace. The message landed like an alarm. Tacitus describes Nero in raw panic, certain that his mother now understood, certain she would strike back, with the guards, with the Senate, with the name of her father behind her. And it is here, in the middle of that night, that our philosopher walks back into the frame, because Nero summoned Seneca and Burrus. What happened in that room is one of the most argued about moments in Roman history, and it is worth noticing how carefully Tacitus himself treats it. He does not claim to know whether the two advisers had been told anything of the plot beforehand. He says the point was unclear, and then he writes what he does have. A long silence when the two men understood what was being asked. Then Seneca, in his account, looking toward Burrus, and asking whether the soldiers could be ordered to carry out the killing. Burrus answering that the praetorians were bound to the whole imperial family and to the memory of Agrippina's father, and would not raise a hand against her. Let the man whose ship had failed finish what he started. He said, and the naval officer went, with armed men, and they found Agrippina in her bedchamber, and they killed her there. One question, spoken by an old man in the middle of the night, is all the record gives us of Seneca in that room. Compliance, or horror, looking for an exit, or a cold reading that the thing was now unstoppable, and the only remaining question was who, or an attempt to hand the decision to the soldier in the hope that the soldier would refuse, and the refusal would end it. Tacitus could not tell. 20 centuries later, neither can we. And any storyteller who claims otherwise is selling you a certainty that does not exist. What comes next is different, because it does not require interpretation at all. In the days that followed, the Senate received a letter explaining the event. It stated that Agrippina had plotted against the emperor, that her agent had been caught, that she had taken her own life when the plot failed. It catalogued her crimes, reaching back through her whole career, and framed her death as the salvation of Rome. The Senate responded with public thanksgiving, and the ancient sources record what everyone in Rome understood. The emperor had signed the letter, but the sentences belonged to Seneca. The finest prose writer of the age had put his gift in the service of the official story. Tacitus notes that the disgust of thoughtful Romans settled not only on Nero, but on the author, precisely because everyone recognized the craftsmanship. This is why the chapter you are listening to carries the name it does. The murder belongs to Nero. The letter belongs to Seneca. Whatever he knew, whatever he intended, whatever he said or did not say in that midnight room, the letter is the thing that survives with his fingerprints on it, and he wrote it after he knew exactly what had happened. A man can be trapped in a room. It is harder to be trapped at a writing desk. There is a detail preserved from the aftermath that belongs to the night listener, so let it close this dark passage. The sources describe Nero in the years that followed as a man who could not sleep properly again, who reportedly dreamed of his mother, who was said to have hired priests to summon and appease her spirit. Rome, which cheered him in public for years afterward, told these stories quietly. The killing of a mother was the crime beneath all crimes, and everyone, including the emperor, including the teacher who wrote the letter afterward, knew that a line had been crossed that could never be walked back. Seneca remained in place, outwardly at the height of his power. Inwardly, everything that follows suggests a man beginning to look for the exit. But leaving the side of a man like Nero was not a matter of resigning. It would take 3 more years, and 1 more death, before the door even appeared. The partnership that had steadied the empire ended in the year 62, in a sick room. Burrus died that year. Tacitus reports the uncertainty that surrounded it. A swelling in the throat, treated with a salve sent by the emperor, and the rumour, which he neither confirms nor dismisses, that the salve was poison. What is certain is what the death removed. The soldier had been half of the structure of restraint, the half that commanded troops, the half whose plain bluntness even Nero hesitated to test. Tacitus writes that the death of Burrus broke the power of Seneca. 1 column cannot hold a roof built for 2. Into the vacancy stepped a man named Tigellinus, and with him this story acquires its final dark figure, a former horse dealer with a gift for reading Nero's appetites. He became commander of the guard, and made himself indispensable in the oldest way, by encouraging every impulse the old advisers had restrained, and by feeding the emperor a steady diet of fear about everyone else. The ancient sources describe the new atmosphere precisely. Where Seneca had steered Nero toward restraint, Tigellinus steered him toward indulgence. And indulgence was always going to win, because indulgence is what the customer wanted. Seneca read the change instantly, and Tacitus preserves, or reconstructs in the manner of ancient historians, the extraordinary scene of his attempted resignation. The old man came to Nero and made a speech that was itself a masterpiece of careful engineering. He thanked the emperor for wealth and honours beyond anything a man of his station could have expected. He compared himself to advisers of earlier emperors who had been permitted, in old age, to retire. Then he made the offer that stunned the court. "Take it all back," he said. "The estates, the money, the gardens that draw envy toward me, everything the emperor's generosity had given, the emperor could reclaim, and the old teacher would be left with what he began with, and be grateful, understand what was actually being negotiated under the polished sentences." Seneca was not discussing property. He was asking to be allowed to survive. The wealth made him a target. The position made him a rival. And he was attempting to trade both for the one thing the palace could no longer give him, a quiet old age. Nero refused. In a reply, Tacitus notes, that was gracious on its surface, and a cage underneath. How would it look? The emperor asked. If his most famous adviser abandoned him, people would say the teacher had fled the student. The gifts stayed. The position stayed. The embrace, Tacitus writes, was warm, and Nero was by now a practised actor who could hide hatred behind a kiss. Seneca understood completely. He had asked for the door and been told the door did not exist. So he built one anyway, quietly, out of habits. The historians describe the method. He pleaded age. He pleaded illness. He stopped receiving the crowds of callers whose visits displayed his influence. He avoided the city, stayed on his estates, travelled little, appeared less and less until absence became his new residence. Officially, he remained the emperor's adviser. In reality, he had begun the longest and most delicate resignation in Roman history. A withdrawal conducted one missed appointment at a time, by a man who knew he was watched. The picture from those years has a strange double exposure. On the surface, an old man on a country estate, walking his vineyards in the early cool of the morning, complaining of his health, dictating letters. Underneath, one of the most famous people in the world, holding a fortune he had tried to give away, listening for hoofbeats on the road. It may be here, in this watched retirement, that we should turn to a side of Seneca this story has barely mentioned. He was also a playwright. A set of tragedies survives under his name: Medea, Phaedra, Thyestes, and others, the only complete Roman tragedies that have come down to us at all. When exactly he wrote them, no one knows. Scholars have argued for decades about their dating, and for some of the plays about their authorship, but their character is not in doubt. And their character is startling. The essays counsel calm, the plays scream. They are full of obsession, revenge, kin, murder, the collapse of reason, blood on palace floors. Thyestes, perhaps the darkest of them, turns on a king who commits an unspeakable crime against his own family. Wrapped in the language of courts and feasts and smiling hatred, readers have wondered for centuries how the philosopher of mercy could have written them. And one long tradition of interpretation offers an answer that fits this chapter of his life almost too well. The plays show what the essays warn against. They are the nightmare versions of the palace he lived in. Rage and appetite with the restraints removed. Whether he wrote them as warnings, as private release, or simply as art in the taste of his time, we cannot know. But if you want to feel what it was like to be near Nero as the restraints came off, the essays tell you the theory. The tragedies show you the weather. And Rome, in the years of his withdrawal, showed him exactly what he was withdrawing from. The emperor, freed from his old restraints, divorced the blameless Octavia, married Poppaea, and then, when the city protested in the streets for the discarded empress, had Octavia banished and killed, her death dressed up with accusations that Tacitus reports nobody believed. She was about 22 years old. The treason trials that Nero's opening speech had promised to abolish came back. Fortunes were confiscated to fund spectacles, and in July of the year 64, fire broke out in the shops near the Great Circus and burned for days, until much of Rome lay in ash. Whether the fire began by accident or by design was argued then and is argued still. What mattered for the temperature of the city was that people believed terrible things, and the emperor, hunting for someone to blame, fixed the guilt on an obscure new sect called the Christians and killed them in ways that, Tacitus writes, moved even a hostile public to pity. On the cleared ground, Nero began building himself a palace so vast that Romans joked the whole city had become one man's house. Somewhere outside all of this, on a country estate, an old man with weak lungs was watching the world he had spent his life managing burn down to its foundations. He could not fix the empire. He could not fix Nero. The project of putting a conscience inside a king had failed, and the proof was in the ashes and the graves. But he had one project left, and it turned out to be the one he was born for. In the enforced leisure of those final years, Seneca stopped writing for emperors and senates and started writing to one man, an old friend serving as a Roman official in Sicily. His name was Lucilius, and the letters that began arriving in Sicily were about to outlive the empire itself. Set the palaces aside now. Forget the Senate, the coinage, the burning city. What remains is one man at a desk, late in the evening, somewhere on a quiet estate outside Rome. In the last 3 years of his life, he is in his late 60s. His lungs are old enemies he has learned to live with. He knows, with the particular clarity of a man who has watched Nero work, that his own death is no longer a question of whether, and what he chooses to do with that knowledge is write letters to a friend. The friend, Lucilius, was a Roman official of modest origins who had risen on his own talent and was then serving in Sicily. 124 of the letters survive. Scholars have long debated what exactly they are. Genuine correspondence that was really sent. A literary form addressed to one man with the whole world reading over his shoulder. Probably something of both. And the debate matters less than it seems. What changes in these pages is not that the performance ends. Seneca was a writer to his bones, and the writer never entirely disappears. What changes is the audience. The Senate is gone. The Emperor is gone. The voice narrows to the distance between two friends, and at that distance it becomes more honest than anything he had written before. The very first letter opens with the subject that ran beneath his whole life, time. He tells Lucilius, in essence, claim yourself for yourself. Gather up your hours and guard them, because time is the one possession that is truly ours, and the only one that cannot be replaced, and yet we hand it out to anyone who asks, as if it cost nothing. People guard their money, he observes. They lock their doors, they count every coin, and then they let their days be taken by anyone with a request. Elsewhere, in a famous essay called On the Shortness of Life, he had developed the larger version of the argument. Life is not short, he insisted there. Life is long enough, and generously given. We make it short by wasting it, by postponing, by living as though we had a second life held in reserve. The person who postpones living, he wrote, loses the day while preparing for the day. Hear how directly that lands. 20 centuries later, in a world of screens and schedules that Seneca could never have imagined but somehow described, this is why these letters sit on nightstands today, while the official literature of Nero's Rome sits in university libraries. Seneca wrote about the problems that do not go away, and he wrote about them in a new kind of sentence. Short, plain, aimed. Earlier, Roman prose rolled like processions. Seneca's prose taps you on the shoulder. The letters range everywhere, but a few threads run through them all, and they are worth walking slowly, because they are the treasure this whole story has been carrying toward you. There is the thread about fear. Most of what we suffer, Seneca argues, happens in imagination before it happens anywhere else, and much of it never happens anywhere else. We suffer more often in apprehension than in reality. He tells Lucilius, the mind runs ahead into disasters that have not arrived and may never arrive, and lives through them in advance, sometimes repeatedly, paying full price for troubles it never actually owns. His remedy is not positive thinking. It is almost the opposite. Look directly at the feared thing. He says, name it. Ask what it would actually require of you. Fear shrinks under examination the way shadows shrink under light. There is the thread about practice. This is where the letters stop being quotations and become a program. Seneca tells Lucilius that he sets aside certain days to live poor. Cheap food, rough clothes, hard sleeping, several days at a stretch. And then, one question, is this what I was afraid of? He is not pretending to be poor, and he knows the difference. He is training, the way a soldier trains in peacetime, so that if fortune ever strips him for real, the condition will already be familiar. Rehearse the thing you dread, and you take away its strangeness. And most of dread is strangeness. There is the thread about crowds, and about friendship, two sides of one coin. He warns Lucilius that nothing damages character like dissolving into a crowd, coming home slightly greedier, slightly crueler, slightly less yourself, infected by the room. Against the crowd he sets the friend, the one person before whom you may think out loud, but choose slowly, he says, and after you have chosen, trust completely, ponder for a long time whether to admit someone into your friendship, but once admitted, welcome them with all your heart, and speak with them as boldly as with yourself. And there is one letter that deserves its own place in this story, because in it a man of his time steps briefly ahead of his time. It is the 47th letter, and it is about slaves. Rome ran on slavery, and almost no one questioned it. Seneca does not quite question the institution either, and honesty requires saying so. But he writes to Lucilius something that almost no Roman of his rank ever put on paper. They are slaves, people say. No, he answers. They are human beings. They are humble friends. They are fellow slaves. If you consider how much power fortune holds over us all. He tells his friend to remember that the man he owns was born of the same stock, smiles under the same sky, breathes as he breathes, lives as he lives, dies as he dies. He mocks the masters who dine in front of standing, silent, hungry servants, and asks his friend to dine with his slaves instead, to let character rather than status decide who deserves respect. Treat your inferiors, he writes, the way you would wish your superiors to treat you, and then he presses the point with the one sentence guaranteed to land on every Roman reader. Remember, every time you consider how much power you hold over your slave, that your own master holds exactly that much power over you. Rome had masters all the way up, and at the top of the ladder sat Nero. Seneca knew precisely what it meant to live at another man's pleasure. The letter is not modern, but it is a door left open in a wall that almost no one else even saw as a wall, and later centuries would walk through it, running under everything, steady as a pulse, is the thread about death. The sick boy from Cordoba, the man who rehearsed his end in 1,000 airless nights, delivers his life's conclusion here. Death, he insists, is not ahead of us. It is already behind us and beside us. Whatever years have passed are already in death's hands. We die every day. He writes, and the hour we fear as the hour of death is only the last of many. A person who understands this stops postponing and stops trembling, because you cannot be robbed of what you hold loosely, and you cannot be ambushed by what you have already met. He goes further, into a sentence that the next chapters of this story will test against reality. He who has learned to die, Seneca writes, has unlearned how to be a slave. It is one thing to write that sentence on a quiet estate. It is another thing to be held to it, in front of witnesses, by armed men. Seneca knew the difference better than anyone, and there are moments in the letters where he admits, with a candour that still disarms, that he is not the finished sage, that he is describing a summit from part way up the mountain, a patient sharing a hospital room with the rest of us, recommending remedies he is still taking himself. That admission is the secret of the letter's survival. People do not return, generation after generation, to a perfect man's instructions. They return to an imperfect man's honesty. While he wrote, Rome darkened around the writing. The palace grew, the trials multiplied, and in the city, among senators and officers who had each privately concluded that the situation had become unsurvivable, something began to form that Rome had not seen in a century, a genuine conspiracy to kill the emperor. It would reach, before it was over, into the philosopher's own family, and then to his door. By the year 65, the question in certain Roman dining rooms was no longer whether Nero deserved to die, but who would do it, and when, and what would come after. The plot that history remembers as the Pisonian conspiracy took its name from its figurehead, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, Attal, éloquent, popular aristocrate, generous with money, famous in the courts, and, by the account of Tacitus, chosen less for his strength than for his availability. He looked like an emperor. For many of the conspirators, that was enough. Around him gathered an alliance remarkable for its breadth. Senators, knights, officers of the Praetorian Guard itself, including one of its two commanders, and at least one woman, a freedwoman named Epicharis, whose part in this story will put every noble Roman in it to shame. Their motives ranged from principle to injury to ambition, and among them was a poet whose presence turns the plot personal for our purposes. Lucan, the most celebrated young writer in Rome, on fire against the emperor who had silenced his work out of jealousy. Lucan was the son of Seneca's youngest brother. The conspiracy had reached inside the philosopher's family. The plan, as Tacitus reconstructs it, went through several versions and settled on the Games of April, where a senator would approach the emperor as a petitioner, seize him, and the others would strike. What undid it was not a soldier or a spy, but the oldest solvent of secrets. Too many people knowing. One conspirator, the night before the appointed day, gave a freedman named Milicus a dagger to be sharpened, spoke of great events, and made arrangements that looked unmistakably like a man preparing either for triumph or for death. The servant weighed loyalty against reward, and at dawn he was at the palace gates. By nightfall the arrests had begun, and Rome learned once again what it looked like when Nero was afraid. The roundup became a slaughter of the city's leadership, driven by torture and denunciation, each prisoner buying hope with names. Against this darkness, one figure stands almost alone. Epicharis, the freedwoman, had approached the fleet at Misenum months earlier to recruit officers. and had been betrayed and arrested even before the plot broke. And now, with every advantage of rank stripped away, she was tortured across successive days to make her name the others. Tacitus records the outcome with open admiration. She named no one. On the second day, broken in body, she ended her life rather than risk being broken further. And the historian pauses over the shame of the comparison that senators and knights were selling their dearest relatives while a former slave woman, protecting people she barely knew, showed Rome what loyalty meant. Then, in the churn of interrogations, a name surfaced that changed the scale of everything. One of the lead conspirators, a man named Natalis, mentioned Seneca. Here the story has to slow down, because this is the accusation that killed him, and it rests on remarkably little. Natalis testified that he had carried messages between Piso and Seneca, and reported a reply in which Seneca allegedly said that his own welfare depended on the safety of Piso. That is the whole of it. One sentence, reported second-hand, by a man being interrogated for his life. Read one way. It is a coded commitment. Read another. It is the courteous evasion of a cautious old man declining to get involved. The ancient equivalent of wishing someone well and changing the subject. Tacitus lays out the ambiguity and does not resolve it. Some in Rome believed a stranger and darker version, which Tacitus records as rumour rather than fact, that certain officers intended, once Nero was dead, to remove Piso as well and offer the empire to Seneca, as the one man whose reputation the public might accept was the philosopher, at the end of his life, a silent candidate for the throne he had spent years standing beside. The sources cannot take us that far, and we should not pretend they can. What they show is narrower and colder. Nero had been handed a thread connecting Seneca to the plot, and Nero had wanted such a thread for 3 years. The emperor sent an officer to the villa where Seneca, returning that day from Campania, had stopped for the evening, a few miles outside Rome. Soldiers surrounded the house, while the old man was at dinner with his wife, Pompeia Paulina, and 2 friends. The officer put the accusation to him. Seneca answered calmly, denying that anything treasonous had passed between himself and Piso, pointing out that he was not a man to trade in vague pledges, and that his health and his retirement were his whole occupation. The officer carried the answer back to the palace, where Nero sat with Poppaea and Tigellinus, and was asked the only question that still mattered. Was the old man preparing to end his life? No, the officer reported. No sign of fear, no sign of anything. Then go back, Nero said, and deliver the sentence. One thing needs saying before this chapter begins. Almost everything that follows comes from Tacitus, writing, about 50 years later, working from earlier accounts and from what Rome remembered. Tacitus was not a camera. He was a great literary artist, and Rome had a long tradition of shaping the deaths of philosophers into exemplary scenes, with Socrates in Athens as the model standing behind them all. So what you are about to hear is 2 things at once. A real event, in a real house, on a real night in the year 65, and a carefully constructed piece of Roman literature about that event. We should hold both in mind, and not pretend we can always see where one ends and the other begins. The officer returned with the sentence: death by his own hand. The standard mercy Rome extended to men of rank in place of public execution. Seneca received it, and his first request was practical. He asked for the tablets containing his will, intending, it seems, to leave gifts to the friends at his table. The officer refused. Even that was forbidden, and so Seneca turned to his friends and said, in the version Tacitus preserves, that since he was prevented from repaying their kindness in property, he would leave them the one possession he still had, and the finest one, the pattern of his own life. The friends were weeping. He talked to them the way he had talked to Lucilius on paper, asking where their philosophy had gone, where the resolve they had rehearsed against exactly this hour. Who had not known what Nero was? After a murdered brother and a murdered mother, he said, what remained except the killing of the teacher? Then he turned to his wife, and the scene stops being philosophy and becomes a marriage. Paulina was much younger than he was. He held her and asked her, gently, in the account we have, not to grieve forever, but to console her loss by contemplating the life he had lived. She answered that she would not be doing her grieving afterward. She had decided to die with him. Seneca did not forbid her. He said, according to Tacitus, that he had shown her the softer path, but he would not deny her the choice she had made. The tradition Tacitus was writing in admired that answer, and expected his readers to admire it too. A modern listener is allowed to hear it differently. It may be the most painful moment in the whole account. A young woman preparing to die for a verdict that was never hers, in a house surrounded by soldiers, where the range of choices available to anyone had already narrowed almost to nothing. What followed was not the serene scene the philosophical tradition had promised, and Tacitus does not hide it. That honesty is the most valuable thing in his account. Seneca was old, and his body, thinned by age and by the plain diet he had practiced for years, would not release him quickly. What should have been swift stretched into something long and painful, and in the middle of it he did something no script would have included. Worried that his suffering would break his wife's courage, and that watching hers would break his, he persuaded her to withdraw to another room. The philosopher, who wrote that the wise man is self-sufficient, spent part of his own death protecting someone else from the sight of it, and even then, at the very edge, he remained what he had been all his life, a writer. Tacitus reports that he called for his secretaries and dictated, while dying, a final discourse, which was published and circulated in Rome, and which was still being read in the historian's own day. It has since been lost. Somewhere in the wreckage of the ancient world, the last dictation of Seneca is missing, and every historian who tells this story pauses to mourn it. The end still would not come. He asked a friend, a doctor, for the poison that Athens had once given to condemned men, the drink of Socrates, which he had reportedly arranged to have ready long in advance. Understand what that preparation means. He had thought about this hour for years, and he had chosen his model, but his body was already failing in ways that defeated even this, and the poison had little effect. In the end, he was carried into a bath of heated water, and the steam of it, closing around lungs that had fought for air since a boy in Corsica first learned what the sighing disease was, finished what nothing else could. As he entered, Tacitus records, He sprinkled some of the water toward the slaves nearest him, and spoke of an offering to Jupiter the Liberator. It was a gesture in the old philosophical language, and Tacitus wrote it down because it completed the scene his readers expected. Whether it felt like liberation to the man himself, in that room, in that body, is a question the sources cannot answer, and this story will leave it with you rather than answer it for him. He was cremated without ceremony, without procession, without the honours of his rank, and this was not neglect. Tacitus notes that Seneca had directed exactly this in his will, written years earlier. At the very height of his wealth and power, the man who could not give his fortune away in life had at least arranged to leave like a man who owned nothing. Paulina survived. Nero, wanting no additional hatred attached to the knight, ordered her saved, and soldiers and servants bound her wounds, whether with her consent or past her caring. The sources cannot say. Tacitus reports that she lived on for a few years, honourably faithful to her husband's memory, with a pallor that never left her face, a living witness to that room. One more fact belongs here, because the story of that year did not stop at one villa. The purge rolled on. Seneca's nephew Lucan, the poet, died under the same sentence, reciting his own verses as he went. Within a year, by order or by pressure, both of Seneca's brothers were dead as well. The family from Corduba, the father's proud project, 3 brilliant sons aimed at the heart of Rome, was erased in a single season. Nero himself outlived his teacher by only 3 years, abandoned by the Senate, the armies, and the guard. He died in a suburban villa in the year 68, and the dynasty of Augustus ended with him. The empire moved on and forgot almost everyone in this story. It did not forget the man in the villa. What happened to Seneca after his death may be the strangest part of the whole tale, because the man Rome condemned as a traitor was about to begin one of the longest afterlives in the history of writing. Most reputations die twice, once with the body, and again a generation later. When the people who remember fade, Seneca's reputation did neither, and it did not simply grow either. It rose, fell, and repeatedly returned, century after century, carried by the one thing Nero could not confiscate, the prose. The first revival came from a direction no one could have predicted. Within a few generations, Christian writers, members of a faith that Rome still persecuted, were reading Seneca and finding themselves startled by what they found. A pagan courtier writing about conscience, about the shared humanity of slaves and masters, about a divine spirit dwelling within each person. By the late 2nd century, the theologian Tertullian could refer to him with a phrase that became famous, calling him, in effect, often one of ours. The affection ran so deep that at some point in antiquity someone composed an entire correspondence between Seneca and the Apostle Paul, letters back and forth, warm and mutually admiring. Scholars are unanimous that the correspondence is a forgery, but it is a forgery that reveals a truth. Early Christianity wanted this man in the family so badly that someone manufactured the adoption papers. That sympathy had practical consequences across the centuries that followed. When the ancient world collapsed, and the survival of every classical text came down to whether monks considered it worth the labour of copying, Seneca was among the pagan authors who kept being copied. His Christian reputation was one reason among several. Alongside his usefulness in schools and the sheer quotability of his prose. However, the balance of causes is drawn. The result is physical and simple. The letters to Lucilius crossed the dark centuries by hand, copy by copy, and that is why you can hear them tonight. Then, in the Renaissance, he found his greatest single reader. A French nobleman named Michel de Montaigne retired to his tower in the 1570s to write about himself, and helped create the modern personal essay, and told his readers plainly where he had learned the music. His borrowings from Seneca run through the essays by the hundreds. The short, direct, self-examining voice that Montaigne handed on to modern literature is, at its root, the voice of the letters. The tragedies had their own second life, stranger and louder. When the playwrights of Elizabethan England went looking for models of serious drama, the complete Roman tragedies available to them were Seneca's, and scholars have traced his fingerprints across that whole blood-soaked stage. The ghosts demanding revenge, the tyrants soliloquizing their way toward crimes, the violence pressing at the edges of the language, the revenge tragedies of Shakespeare's London, up to and including the greatest of them, grew in soil that Seneca had prepared. The quiet philosopher of the letters and the screaming stage of Hamlet's ancestors are the same man's estate. Not every century was kind to him. Later, readers accused him of writing better than he lived, and some influential critics dismissed his prose as clever rather than deep, and there were long stretches when his reputation sat lower than it had 100 years before. He has always been an argument as much as an author, but he never disappeared, and the 20th and 21st centuries did something with him that no earlier age had quite done. They made him practical again. When the founders of cognitive approaches to therapy described the ancestry of their methods, some of them pointed back to the Stoics, to the insight that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about events. Historians of psychology draw the lines of influence with care, and no one should mistake Seneca for a clinician. But the family resemblance is visible to anyone who reads his letters on fear beside a modern workbook on anxious thought. Examine the fear, test it against evidence, ask what is actually in your control. A voice from the 1st century is present, at least as an ancestor, in counselling rooms today, and in our own generation. Stoicism returned as a broad popular movement, in books and podcasts and online communities, read by athletes, soldiers, founders, and ordinary tired people. Of the 3 great Roman Stoics, the slave Epictetus, the emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, it is Seneca who is usually called the most readable, precisely because he was the least perfect. Marcus gives you the view from the summit. Seneca writes from part way up the mountain, out of breath, honest about the distance remaining. Modern readers, it turns out, trust the struggling climber more than the arrived saint. If this journey through one long Roman life earned a place in your evening, Legends Uncovered tells one great life at a time, and we would be glad to have you with us for the next one. And here is a small question to carry into sleep. Seneca spent his last years writing letters to one friend, and they turned out to be for the whole world. If you wrote one letter that would still be read in 2,000 years, who would you address it to? which brings this story back, one last time, to the question it has carried from the beginning, the contradiction never resolved. He wrote that wealth could never make a person free, and held 300 million sesterces. He wrote the book on mercy, and wrote the letter after the murder. He taught that the wise man needs nothing, and spent a decade at the centre of everything. The scholars who love him and the scholars who cannot forgive him are both still publishing. 2,000 years on, and perhaps that is the finding, we do not keep reading Seneca because he lived up to his own sentences. We keep reading him because he wrote the sentences down with perfect clarity, fell short of them in full public view, kept trying anyway, and left the whole record, the wisdom and the failures together, where anyone could find it. He knew this about himself. That may be the deepest reason the letters feel alive. He was not writing down at us from virtue. He was writing across to us from trouble. I am not telling you what I have done. He admits to Lucilius, in one letter, I am telling you what we both ought to do. Like a patient in the next bed, describing the treatment, every honest person who has ever fallen short of their own standards, which is every honest person, has a friend in that sentence. Somewhere tonight, someone who has never studied philosophy is lying awake with a worry, and opening a page written by a tired man on a Roman estate 2,000 years ago, and feeling, with a small shock of recognition, that it was written for them. The advice is still arriving, 20 centuries out, like light from a star that is gone. He wrote once that he was working for later generations. On that claim, at least, no one has ever called him a hypocrite.